Hello to you. I do hope you're well. Welcome to this GCSE Religious Studies video. I'm Ben Wardle, and today we're revising Theme D, Religion, Peace and Conflict for the AQA Paper 2 exam. Let's begin with a look at the AQA specification, which tells us the topics we need to know, and we will be talking through all of them in today's video, starting with peace, justice, forgiveness and reconciliation. We'll also be talking about violence, including violent protest, terrorism, war, just war theory and holy war, pacifism, weapons of mass destruction, and finally, religion and peacemaking. Remember, we'll be answering 5 questions in this section of the exam, which will be worth a total of 24 marks. So I would be spending about 24 minutes answering these 5 questions, beginning with question 1, which is worth 1 mark, and will ask us to identify the correct key word from a choice of A, B, C, and D. Question 2 is also worth 1 mark, and it will ask us to give 1. So that means you need to bullet point 1 religious teaching about the topic in the question. I would start by stating the religion, for example, Christians, and then summarising the teaching in 1 line. Question 3 is worth 4 marks, and it will ask us to explain 2 similar or 2 different teachings. So if it says similar, the teachings need to agree with each other on the topic, whereas if it says different, they need to disagree with each other on the topic. Remember to read the second line of the question, which tells us which religions to refer to. For example, that in your answer, you must refer to the main religion of Great Britain, which is Christianity. Question 4 is worth 6 marks, and it will ask us to explain with reference. So make sure that one of your 2 explanations has stated a source of religious authority, such as the Bible or Quran, and then applied it as part of your explanation. And finally, question 5 is worth 12 marks, and it will, of course, ask us to evaluate the statement. So I would begin by writing a 1-sentence introduction in which you define the keyword from the question. I would then explain 2 reasons to agree with the statement, make sure you're developing those arguments with religious teachings and then links back to the question. I would then explain 2 reasons to disagree with the statement, and again, make sure you are developing those arguments with religious teachings and links back to the question. In order to secure your grade 9, make sure that you are making judgments about the strengths of your arguments. For example, that this is a strong argument for Christians because it is based on a teaching from the Bible, which they believe is the infallible word of God. And then finally, remember to reach a justified conclusion at the end. So this is where you make a final judgment as to whether you agree or disagree with the statement. And remember to explain the reason why. Let's have a look at all of the previous 12-mark statements that have been on the paper over the years so that we can plan and prepare for this year's question. If we have a look at 2018, we had to evaluate if war is the best way to solve problems between countries. Other statements have been that religious believers should never fight in a war. It is wrong for any country to have weapons of mass destruction. Greed or just wanting a better life are never good reasons for going to war. Being prepared to fight a war is the best way to keep the peace. All religious believers should be pacifist and never fight. Self-defense is the only good reason for going to war. And in 2025, war should never be described as holy. So, of course, if we look at the key trends and patterns emerging here, we can see there is always a focus on war. And we can see the word war is used in many of these statements. And so, of course, that can help us to plan and prepare for this year's 12-mark question on theme D. Now, of course, the 12-mark question could be on any topic from the specification. But I do think, based on these previous questions, we can start to plan our revision around evaluating war. So the key question that we'll be asking as we go through today's video is, do you think that religious believers can support war? What reasons might a Christian or a Muslim support war, or should they be pacifist? And Pacifism is the belief that war and violence are always wrong. So that will be a really key AO2 focus for us as we go through today's video. Let's begin by talking about 4 key terms that are foundational for Theme D, and we will be referring back to them throughout today's video. They are peace, justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation. In a moment, we'll talk about why they're important for Christians and Muslims. But first, let's begin with our definitions. Peace means the opposite of war. It is harmony between all people in society. Justice means bringing fairness back to a situation. And then we've got 2 key terms that go hand in hand. Firstly, forgiveness. This means letting go of blame against a person for what they've done. So it's about drawing a line and moving on. And then reconciliation goes one step further. It's about then making up and rebuilding relationships between 2 groups and sides after a disagreement. So forgiveness will come first, because it's where you're saying, I let go of blame and I'm prepared to draw a line. And then reconciliation goes one step further, because you're then actually reaching out and you are rebuilding that relationship. You are reconnecting with that person who has caused you harm. Let's talk about the importance then of these 4 key terms, beginning with our Christian teachings. And in the Bible, Jesus teaches Christians, blessed are the peacemakers. He said in his Sermon on the Mount that blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. So, of course, that teaches Christians the importance of working for peace in the world today. One title given to Jesus is that he is the Prince of Peace. And remember, he is an important source of authority for Christians as the key teacher and role model, because he is the incarnate Son of God. So they would be taking his teaching seriously and they would be putting them into action in their lives today. If we think about why peace is important, we can link this to the sanctity of human life and the idea that we're made imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God. All human life is sacred, and so it needs to be protected. So, of course, Christians would work for peace in the world today so that everybody can live in a peaceful, happy, and harmonious society where they're not at risk of being harmed or even killed. We could also link it to stewardship and that duty to look after the environment, because, of course, if there was a war, if there is conflict between people, that could lead to the environment, the whole world, being damaged or destroyed. So that is why peace is important. Let's talk about justice, our next key term, and the Old Testament teaches to seek justice. So that is a really important command that would encourage Christians to work for justice and uphold fairness in the world today. Justice means standing up for what is right and protecting the vulnerable. Remember, if we link this to the nature of God and the day of judgment, Christians believe that God is a fair and just judge. So, of course, they would be upholding justice in their everyday lives because they believe it is important, and that is part of their preparation for the day of judgment, when God will hold them to account for all of their earthly actions. And if we talk about protecting the vulnerable in particular, Jesus said that whatever you've done for the least of people, you've done for me. So that reaffirms the importance of treating people fairly and making sure you are protecting the vulnerable. Our next teaching is from Jesus. He said to forgive not 7, but 77 times. Now, I don't think he's saying you need to get a calculator and keep count of how many times you've forgiven. I actually think he's saying the exact opposite. He is saying you should not limit how many times you will forgive somebody. Forgiveness should be ongoing and it should be without limits. Now, he modeled this himself in the Bible when he was being crucified on the cross. He said, Father, forgive them. So Jesus was prepared to forgive those who had crucified him to death. And Christians believe in the same way, they should be prepared to forgive those who have caused them harm in the world today. And then finally, a quote on reconciliation. St. Paul wrote that God reconciled us through Christ. And again, that's referring to the crucifixion, which Christians believe is the act of atonement, restoring the relationship between God and humanity. So that act on the cross, the act of atonement, was rebuilding the relationship which had been damaged by Adam and Eve when they disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden. So Christians believe that they should be working for reconciliation in the world today, because that then emulates Christ's example through his sacrificial death on the cross, which, as we know, is seen as the act of atonement, rebuilding the relationship between God and humanity. And of course, reconciliation is important because it restores harmony in society. So again, we can link that to the sanctity of human life and the belief that we're all made imago Dei, in the image and the likeness of God. Let's have a look at why these key terms are important for Muslims. The Quran teaches to say words of peace. Remember, the Quran is the infallible and inerrant word of God, so all of its teachings must be taken seriously. We know that peace is central to Islamic teachings. The word itself can be translated as meaning peace. And it should be promoted because unity is very important within Islamic teachings. If we think about the Ummah, the global Islamic community, the unity and oneness of the community is absolutely key. And of course, we can link that to Tawheed, the unity and oneness of God, which should then be reflected in the Ummah, the Muslim community. And so peace is important because it restores and ensures harmony between all people. And again, we can link that to the sanctity of life, the Islamic belief that human life is sacred and holy. And so you should be saying words of peace even against those who are hostile or aggressive towards you. Our next teaching is again from the Quran. Stand firmly for justice even against yourselves or your relatives. So that really emphasizes the importance of being fair and upholding justice. And if we link this to the Day of Judgment, Muslims believe that God is a fair and just judge who will hold you to account for all your earthly actions. So it is important to be upholding justice and working for fairness in the world today. Prophet Muhammad taught that all people are equal, like the teeth of a comb. So all people should be treated fairly and seen equally. Our next teaching is from Prophet Muhammad in the Hadith. He said, forgive others and God will forgive you. So of course that shows that forgiving other people means God will forgive you in return. One of the titles given to God in the Quran is most merciful. So in order for God to be merciful towards you, you should be merciful towards those who have caused you harm. And an excellent example of this is Prophet Adam, who asked God for forgiveness and he was forgiven. So it teaches Muslims to be merciful and to be forgiving towards those who have harmed them. And then a final teaching from Prophet Muhammad, he said, whoever makes reconciliation is rewarded by God. So of course, if something is being rewarded, that means it is being encouraged. And that is because rebuilding relationships is a very important Islamic teaching. As we mentioned, the unity and the oneness of the community is absolutely key. So it is right that you should be rebuilding relationships and restoring harmony. Making peace between people is highly valued and rewarded. Again, we can link that to the sanctity of human life and also of stewardship. Muslims believe we have been appointed as caliphs, which means caretakers of creation. So of course, we want to restore harmony and unity to ensure that human life is protected, but of course that the planet is protected as well, because as we're going to talk about later, war and indeed the weapons of mass destruction are very, very destructive, not only for human life, but for the entire planet. So peace, justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation. 4 key concepts, very much foundational for Theme D, that we will be referring back to throughout today's video. You will see these quotes several times as we go through the topics. And important to remember that you can use the same quotes and teachings for multiple questions. So if you've used a quote for question 4, for example, you can then also use it as part of one of your arguments for question 5. So as we go through the video, you will find that there are quotes and teachings that you particularly like and that you personally find most memorable. So I would be writing them down. I'd then commit them to memory so you can then use them in the exam. Let's talk about our next topic, shall we? Which is violence. And violence is behaviour involving physical force, which intends to hurt, kill, or cause damage. So we're going to be asking whether Christians or Muslims would ever support the use of violence. And our key case study is going to be violent protest. So can violence ever be used as part of protest? The definition of the word protest is that it is a statement or action to express disagreement. So can we ever use physical force to express disagreement? Well, this is something that Jesus actually did in the New Testament. So I know we've just said that he is the Prince of Peace and he taught, blessed are the peacemakers. But the cleansing of the temple is a really interesting example that we can use in the exam to say there are certain circumstances or situations when violent protest might actually be justifiable for Christians. So this took place at the start of Holy Week when Jesus had arrived into Jerusalem and he entered the temple, which of course was the place of worship and the house of God. And he found that traders and money changers were actually exploiting the worshippers and had turned this holy place into a marketplace. So the New Testament tells us that he overturned the tables. Now, really important to note, he didn't harm anybody. So, he didn't start punching people or causing physical harm. But what he did do is cause damage. As we can see from that artistic depiction there, he overturned the tables. And that was in protest against their misuse of the temple for profit, that they were putting their profit over God. And he actually said to them, you have turned my father's house into a den of robbers. So we will be asking, does that mean that violence can be used as part of protest? Not necessarily that you can then start punching and harming people, but that you can use physical force to express disagreement. Well, let's actually start by disagreeing with violence, including as part of protest, because we're going to look at why Christians and Muslims might always be against violence in any circumstances or scenarios. And we'll begin with a very famous teaching from Jesus. He said to turn the other cheek. And this is a scenario where somebody has slapped you. So he says, if somebody has slapped you, you should not slap them back. Instead, you should turn the other cheek and offer that one to them as well and say, do you want to slap me on the other side of my face as well? This is radical non-violence, isn't it? It's saying, even if someone has slapped you, you should not retaliate, you shouldn't take revenge, you shouldn't respond. Instead, you should turn the other cheek. So we could say that that is a very clear teaching from Jesus that violence is always wrong, that even if someone has harmed you, you should not retaliate or respond. So even when you are being hurt yourself, someone has been violent towards you, that does not justify violence. That instead, you should turn to them the other cheek. So a very radical and demanding teaching there. Another great quote is from Martin Luther King Jr., and he was a Christian Baptist minister and leader of the civil rights movement. He said that we must use the weapon of love. So he was teaching Christians that they should challenge injustice using peaceful methods of protest. For example, protest marches and civil disobedience. It might involve boycotting, for example. So he said that we can only pursue peaceful ends by using peaceful means. So of course, The ultimate goal is peace and harmony. So he said the only way to get there is by using peaceful methods. So he said that we must use the weapon of love. You should actually show kindness and you should show forgiveness to the oppressors and to those who have harmed you. You have to show them that there is another way, and you should only use peaceful methods to achieve your protest goals. And then a teaching we could use from the Quran is that whoever kills a soul, it is as if he has killed all mankind. So, of course, that is referring to the sanctity of human life and the idea that human life is sacred. We know from the definition that violence is behaviour involving physical force, which intends to hurt or kill. So, of course, that would be seen as wrong because the Quran has said that killing a soul, one soul, is as if you've killed all of humanity. So that shows you the worth and the value of every human life. So violence should be avoided. It should not be used because it could lead to us harming or even killing a human being, which would violate the sanctity of life. And it would be the same as killing all of humankind. What about our support for violence then? And please remember, we're not going to say that Christians and Muslims think you should use violence when you want and towards who you want. You know, we're not going to say that Jesus wants you to go and start punching people in the street. But what we could argue in the exam is that there are strictly limited circumstances, for example, in self-defense or as part of protest, that violence could be justified. So let's have a look at those teachings. One teaching we've already mentioned today is from the Old Testament, which teaches Christians to seek justice. So this is the idea that the end justifies the means. And we could use this for the example of violent protest, because you could say that if the end goal is to restore justice, which remember means fairness, you could use violence as part of protest. And that might be particularly justified when it is as a last resort. So let's imagine that you've begun with peaceful protest. You've done a protest march, you've done boycotts, you've tried to have dialogues and discussions, but that is not working. It's not having any impact. And you can see that injustice and unfairness is continuing. We could say that if your goal is to seek justice, you could be justified in using violence as part of protest in order to express disagreement and in order to make your point very clearly. We could say that that is what Jesus was doing, that he knew that going into the temple and saying to people, could you please not do this, wouldn't have an impact. He needed to send a very clear message that what was happening was completely unacceptable. And so he did that by overturning the tables, because of course that attracted attention and it made people realize he thought what they're doing is wrong. You know, he was very clearly protesting there against the misuse of the temple for profit. He was saying you cannot turn a holy place into a marketplace. So we could make the argument that if what you're seeing is so unjust, it needs to stop immediately, then we need to turn to violent protest in order to really forcefully express that disagreement. You know, we can't allow this to continue. We need to send a very clear message and we need to put a stop to it immediately. And if your peaceful methods are proven futile, they're not working, nobody is listening, then maybe we could be justified in using violence as part of that protest. Another quote that could justify the use of violence is from Exodus in the Old Testament, which says an eye for an eye. Now, this is a teaching about justice and the idea of proportionate revenge. So it is, as I mentioned, from the Old Testament, and it's the idea that whatever someone has done to you, you are justified to respond in the same way. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and at its most extreme, life for life. So that could be used to justify capital punishment for murderers. We could say violence is justified if it is proportionate revenge. So somebody has harmed you, you could be justified in harming them as a result. And we could link that to the justice system and say it is necessary for fairness, that if somebody has harmed you, it is only fair that you can harm them in the same way. But of course, our counter argument to that is from Jesus in the New Testament, when he said that instead you should be turning the other cheek, that you should not be seeking eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You should actually be turning the other cheek. And you should, of course, then be exercising forgiveness. A final teaching then that could support the limited use of violence is from the Quran. And this verse underpins the lesser jihad, the external struggle to defend Islam from threat. And the verse says to fight in the way of God those who fight you. So this teaches Muslims that violence can be allowed in self-defense against attack. So it's saying that you can fight to defend yourself from attack, and that would be with God's blessing and support. So that verse is one we'll be referring to many times throughout today's video, because we'll be talking about the lesser jihad and whether we can use violence or indeed fight in a war for the purpose of self-defense. Does that justify using violence? If you are under attack, if somebody is being violent towards you or indeed towards vulnerable and innocent people, does that justify the use of violence and physical force? As I say, a great quote to use is from the Quran: to fight in the way of God those who fight you. So being really explicit there about when fighting can be allowed, that it is in self-defense or in defense of the religion or indeed defense of innocent people. And the verse goes on to say, but do not overstep the limit. So we'll talk about that more in terms of just war theory later on. But for now, if we just take a step back, important to consider both sides of the argument. Can the use of violence be justified, for example, as part of violent protest in order to express disagreement, as Jesus did in the cleansing of the temple? Can violence be justified in self-defense, for example, the lesser jihad in Islam? Or is violence always wrong? As Martin Luther King Jr. said, we must use the weapon of love. Let's have a look at our next topic now, shall we? Which is terrorism. And this is not a topic where you would be asked to give different views. The exam board are very clear that there is only one view in both Christianity and Islam, which is that terrorism is wrong. So you could be asked to give two similar teachings about terrorism, and of course you'd be explaining why both Christians and Muslims believe that it is wrong. Let's have a look at the definition before we look at the teachings from both religions. It is the use of violence and threats to intimidate others, used for political purposes to build fear in the ordinary population and to secure demands from government. So if we think of the word itself, it literally says terror. So it's not just about taking away innocent lives, but it's also then creating terror and fear amongst the ordinary population, amongst civilians who are going about their everyday life. Some key case studies are the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the 7/7 bombings in London, the Ariana Grande concert attack, and the Westminster Bridge attack as well. So it's not just about the loss of life, but it's then about the impact on everyday life, because of course people are then scared, they are terrified, they have been terrorized in terms of going about their everyday lives. They are then worried what could happen to them. So let's start by talking about why Christians believe this is wrong. And of course, the 10 Commandments in the Bible say, do not murder. So of course, that would very clearly, very strongly oppose terrorism, because you are murdering many innocent people. As we mentioned before, Christians believe humans are made in the image of God, Imago Dei, so murder and taking away human life is always wrong. Terrorism breaks God's command by intentionally killing innocent people. Another teaching is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The Church says that terrorism is gravely against justice and charity. So I think that is a great quote for us to use, because we can then refer back to the key term and the key concept of justice, that it is unfair because it causes indiscriminate harm and fear. That's something we'll talk about when we discuss just war theory and the idea that innocent civilians cannot be targeted. The point of terrorism is that it is the innocent people going about their everyday lives who are being targeted. And that then, of course, creates extensive fear amongst the ordinary population. So terrorism is wrong because it is unfair in that it is targeting completely innocent people. And of course, it goes against charity and those Christian ideals of love as well. So it contradicts Christian teachings of love, justice, and protecting others. Whereas with violent protest, we could say it might be justified if it is to seek justice. We've obviously said that terrorism is against justice. So this cannot be justified because of the amount of harm it causes, in particular to innocent people. Let's have a look at our Islamic teachings. Remember, the Quran says that whoever has killed a soul, it is as though he has killed all mankind. Remember, terrorist attacks kill many innocent people. That would violate the sanctity of life, the belief that human life is sacred and holy because it has been created by God. Terrorism deliberately targets civilians and is therefore strongly condemned. Another verse from the Quran teaches, do not kill yourselves or others. And of course, if we think about the nature of these attacks, they often involve suicide bombings, that the person themselves is killed as a result of the attack. So, of course, that would violate this verse from the Quran. First of all, do not kill yourselves. And of course, do not kill other people. So it violates the sanctity of life. And of course, it go against the idea that God is sovereign over human life. The Quran says that no one may die except by permission of God at an appointed time. So terrorism violates the sanctity of life. You are taking your own life in many cases because they are suicide attacks, but you are then also murdering innocent life. So it would, of course, be condemned by both Christians and Muslims. Our next topic is war. And remember, from the past paper questions, this is a key area of focus for our Theme D revision. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now thinking about war in terms of the reasons for it, the victims of it, and then how Christians and Muslims feel about it. Can Christians and Muslims ever support war? What might be the reasons that they do? Or should all Christians and all Muslims be against wars? We'll talk about pacifism in just a moment's time, which is the belief that religious people should be completely against all violence and all wars. Let's begin by defining what the word war means. It refers to armed conflict between two or more sides. If we think about some reasons for war taking place, it might be over land, it might be in retaliation, in response to injustice, it could be for self-defense, it could be over natural resources, or protecting innocent people. I wonder of those reasons, which one you think might be the most justifiable, so which could be supported, and then which is the least justifiable. So why would that not be a justified reason for going to war? If we think about what then happens as a result of war, of course, there is a lot of death and destruction. So there are always innocent victims. Victims of war are the people harmed during a war, for example, those killed, injured, or left homeless. Now, we need to know for this exam two key ideas about war. The first one is just war theory, and the second is a holy war. So let's talk about just war theory. This is a set of rules for fighting a war in a way believed to be justified and acceptable to God. Now, this was developed by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and it's all about when a war can be justified, that it is being fought for the right reasons, and that it is then conducted in the right way. So they're the key areas of focus for deciding, is that war justified? Is it being fought with the right intention behind it? Is it being fought for the right reasons? And then secondly, once you do start fighting, are you fighting it in the right way? How is that war being conducted? For example, are innocent people being protected? Is your use of force proportionate? So just war theory is about deciding, can this war be justified in terms of the reasons for it and the method of fighting it? We will talk about that in a moment. We then have our next key concept here, which is a holy war. And a holy war is exclusively religious. So whereas just war theory would be used by religious people to decide if the war is justified, it can still be over non-religious reasons. So when we are applying just war theory, we can apply that to any war that is being fought over any reason. Whereas holy war is exclusively for a religious war. It is a war being fought in the name of religion and for religious reasons. And it's a war that's being declared by a religious authority. Whereas, of course, when we're talking about just war theory, the focus is on it being declared by a legitimate authority. So that could be a prime minister or a president, not necessarily the Pope or a religious leader. So really important to know that distinction, that just war theory can be applied to any war, and it's about deciding, is it justifiable? Is it being fought for the right reasons in the right way? Whereas holy war is exclusively over religion and about religion. So do we think that any wars, whether they are a holy war or not, can be fought? Well, let's start by talking about Christianity, shall we? And as I mentioned, just war theory is the criteria that the Catholic Church would use to decide if a war can be justified. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that there are strict conditions when war can be justified. And the only way to justify a war is if it is for the right reasons and it is then fought in the right way. So St. Thomas Aquinas, all the way back in the 13th century, obviously before the modern methods of warfare, before weapons of mass destruction, he came up with this criteria. And what you need to do in order to justify the war is tick off each of these bullet points. So he said it can only be justified if it has a just cause, if it is with the right intention, if it is as a last resort, if it's been declared by a legitimate authority, and if there is a reasonable chance of success. And then he said, if you do then proceed to actually having the war, it needs to be fought in the right way. So the force used must be proportionate and civilians must not be targeted. This is the checklist, and it is what the Catholic Church would use to decide if a war can be justified. So let's talk about the right reasons. So just cause is about the reason. What is the cause? What is the trigger, if I can put it like that, for the conflict? So if we look at the list on the left, we've had land, retaliation, injustice, self-defense, natural resources, protecting innocent people as just a couple of examples. So you have to begin by asking, is the cause justified? You then have to think, is the war itself being declared for the right intention? So are you just wanting to cause lots of harm, or is your intention to bring about peace or to seek justice? So if the intention is to bring about peace and restore fairness, then that could be justifiable. But if your intention is that you just want to keep fighting and cause as much damage, that would be unjustified. So it's got to have a just cause, and there's got to be the right intention behind your declaration of war. And that's all about what it is you want to achieve at the end. It's got to be declared as a last resort. So you've got to have tried other means of resolving the issue before you then resort to war. So you've got to try peaceful negotiation. You've got to try dialogue and discussion before you then get the tanks out and send the warships. So it's got to be as a last resort, that you've tried every other means and you've tried every other method of resolving that issue before you then use armed conflict. It's got to have been declared by legitimate authority. So, a random person on the street can't come along and declare there's going to be a war. It has to have been declared by someone in a position of power. For example, the Prime Minister or the President. So they have got to have made that declaration. They've got to have made that informed decision. And then finally, it's got to be with a reasonable chance of success. You cannot declare a war that you have no chance of winning whatsoever, that is going to prove futile and pointless. So there's got to be the right intention, that there's a really good end goal behind it, and you've got to be able to get there. You've got to have a chance of succeeding in achieving those aims. You can't declare war on a country with an army that is 1,000 times more powerful than yours, because you're just not going to win. It's going to be futile. It's going to be pointless. You're going to be wiped out almost instantly. So really interested to hear your thoughts, actually. Do you agree with Aquinas that they are the right reasons for a war? Do you think that one of them is particularly important? Do you think one or even more is no longer important? Does it matter about your chance of success? If you've got a just cause, is that not enough? Do you really have to calculate your chance of success? If there is such a level of injustice, should you not have a war anyway, whether you think you could win it or not? Really interested to hear your thoughts. Also about legitimate authority. When we talk about weapons of mass destruction, the only person who is able to authorize the use of nuclear weapons is the Prime Minister. So when we talk about war more generally, do we think that that is correct? Who is the person with the authority to declare war? Is that the elected Prime Minister? Is that the President? Does anybody have that authority, or should it be anybody else? Should we actually say anyone can declare a war? You don't have to have legitimate authority. If you think war needs to take place, should you be able to declare one? And then last resort as well, do we think that that is correct, or should we be quicker to move to war? Is there a purpose? Is there a point in trying to resolve it peacefully, or should we just go straight to declaring a war on our adversaries? So they are the right reasons as Aquinas set them out. Really important, you think, is he correct? Do you think that they are all right reasons? Is one of them particularly important? Are any of them no longer relevant? And then, of course, if you do proceed to warfare, if you do say the right reasons have been met, we're going to now begin the war. Really important for him that it is conducted in the right way. There are 2 points here. The first one is that force must be proportionate, so it needs to be balanced. It can't be that your adversary has killed one of your soldiers, so you drop a nuclear bomb that kills 100,000 civilians. Everything has to be balanced and proportionate. And then the second one is that civilians must not be targeted. Now, of course, there might be situations where they are harmed because they've been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but they cannot be directly targeted. It is only combatants, people who are fighting in the war, that can be targeted during the war. So again, do we think he's correct that that is the right way to fight a war? Should force be proportionate? And is it correct that civilians must not be targeted? If we think about how you end the war, if everything is always proportionate, will that bring the war to an end at any point? Or do you actually need to use as much force as you can to end that war as quickly as you can? So that is our Christian just war theory developed by St. Thomas Aquinas. Make sure you know those right reasons and the right way. But also, of course, make sure you're evaluating whether you agree with those reasons. Do you think that he's right about those reasons or not? Let's now talk about holy war in Christianity. And a quote from the Old Testament, from Ecclesiastes, is that there is a time for war. So that verse of the Bible is saying that there is a time and a place for everything and that includes war. So you could argue that some Christians believe war may be necessary to restore justice or to defeat wrongdoing. And in the Old Testament, God commands wars to defeat evil and protect faith. For example, in Deuteronomy, it teaches you must destroy them. So, quite forceful language there, being really clear that war can sometimes be justified for religious causes. And remember, holy war is a war being fought in the name of religion and for religious reasons. Let's have a look at our Islamic teachings now, shall we? And whenever we are discussing war in Islam, our key example in terms of its justification would be the lesser jihad. So in terms of our Islamic teachings, jihad means struggle. There is the lesser jihad, which is the external struggle, and then the greater jihad, which is the inner struggle. So the inner struggle to be a good Muslim, and then the outer struggle to defend the religion from external threat. And the key quote you need to know is to fight in the way of God, those who fight you, but do not overstep the limit. So there are two parts to that. It is, first of all, about the right reason that you are fighting those who fight you. So it is justified in self-defense. And then secondly, in the right way. So a really clear parallel there between Christianity and Islam in terms of justifying war that is fought for the right reasons and in the right way. So fight in the way of God, those who fight you, would be that it is being waged for the right reason, and then do not overstep the limits would be about how the war is conducted, that it is being fought in the right way. As I've put here, fighting is allowed only in self-defense and must follow strict rules. For example, innocent civilians must not be targeted, and you must stop fighting when the enemy surrenders, because that is all part of not overstepping the limits. It would be overstepping the limits to target innocent civilians or to continue fighting after your enemy has surrendered. And that, as we've mentioned, is the lesser jihad. It is the external struggle to defend Islam and protect innocent people. So just war theory encapsulated there in that verse from the Quran, to fight in the way of God, those who fight you, but do not overstep the limits. Those two key components there of the right reasons and the right way. If we talk about holy war, the Quran says that permission to fight is given to those who are wronged. So fighting is allowed in self-defense or against injustice, which some would argue is a justification for holy war. Now, really important, I think, to consider the context in which Islam began. And we know that Prophet Muhammad was born into a time and a place of polytheism and idolatry. And remember, Prophet Muhammad and his early followers faced a lot of persecution that led to him fleeing to Medina and then returning to Mecca in the conquest of Mecca. So we know that the earliest Muslims did fight in holy wars because they were facing persecution. And we then have to ask, is war still relevant? Are the teachings, for example, about the lesser jihad still relevant today? So if we think about the 21st century, can Christians and Muslims still justify war, for example, in defense of the religion? A teaching from Prophet Muhammad is that we have finished the lesser jihad. Now we will focus on the greater jihad. Could that mean that holy war is no longer needed and no longer required? Because, for example, we have freedom of religion, we have religious rights where people have the right to practice their religion. So really interesting to think about, obviously, the history of both religions, but also the current situation. We do know that persecution continues against religious groups around the world. Does that justify war? Or are there now different means in the modern world to actually defend religion and ensure that people can practice their religion? So really interesting to think about not only just war and whether war in general can be justified if it is for the right reasons and in the right way, but then in particular, holy war. Would God say war is required? Is it possible to say God would sanctify this war? God wants this war to happen. Or is that wrong? Well, our group who would say it is wrong are pacifists, because a pacifist is somebody who believes that all violence is wrong, which then, of course, affects all behaviours. So our key example is going to be Martin Luther King Jr., who was our civil rights leader and very famously a pacifist. He said, and it was all based on his Christian beliefs, he was a Baptist minister, that we must use the weapon of love, that we should seek peace using peaceful means. And another case study we'll use is conscription. So if there was conscription where the government is saying people have to fight, do you think that people could say, well, because of my religion, I am not going to take part. I'm going to be a conscientious objector. That is what Quakers do. They are a denomination of Christian who are pacifists. They say that their Christian beliefs means that they are committed to non-violence, that it means they would not fight in a war. But of course, St. Paul wrote in the Bible to submit to the governing authorities. So we will be discussing, well, what do you then do in terms of, do you submit to the governing authorities and their decision to declare a war? Remember, Aquinas said that declaration of war by legitimate authority is a just cause, and it is a right reason. Or should you say, I am objecting to this war, I will not be fighting because of my religious beliefs? Let's start by talking about why a religious person might be a pacifist, in that they have a radical commitment to non-violence. So pacifism is the belief that all violence is always wrong, which then, of course, affects all of their behaviours. In terms of our support for this, we could use that quote from Jesus, to turn the other cheek, because, of course, we know that he taught forgiveness. He said, forgive not 7, but 77 times. And he taught non-violence. He said, do not retaliate, even if someone has used force against you. So that would show Christians to respond to violence with peace. So you should be forgiving, you should be reconciling, you should be using peaceful means rather than responding with violence. So turn the other cheek would support pacifism, that even if you are attacked, you cannot use violence. Another quote, which we've mentioned, is from Martin Luther King Jr., who is our key example of a pacifist. He said, we must use the weapon of love. He was a Baptist minister, inspired by Christian teachings and the example set by Jesus. He argued that only peaceful protest can bring about change without causing further harm, as he said, to seek peace using peaceful means. So he said that all violence is wrong, and of course that means that you would refuse to fight in a war. And that is the Quaker idea of being a conscientious objector, that based on your beliefs, you would refuse to fight in a war if the government asked you, because you believe your religious beliefs prevent you from doing so. And that is because, in this case, you are Christian. So you believe in forgiveness, reconciliation, and non-violence. You could, of course, link that to the sanctity of life and the idea that human life is sacred and holy. We are all made Imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God. So all human life must be protected. It cannot ever be taken away. You could also link that to the idea of being a steward, that you've got to take care of creation and not destroy it, which of course would happen in a war. Why would religious people oppose pacifism then? So why would they disagree with being a pacifist? And that obviously means there are certain cases, there are certain scenarios where war can be justified and it should be supported. Well, if we look at our Christian teachings, the Old Testament says an eye for an eye. So some Christians believe violence can be justified in retaliation or to bring about justice. That, of course, is based on a teaching from the Old Testament, from Exodus. So there are times when violence can be justified in revenge or retaliation for retributive justice. Apologies. So it's about that balance, that you should be able to use violence in the same way it's being used against you. Another quote we could use is from St. Paul. He said to submit to the governing authorities. So Christians may support war if declared by legitimate authority, such as the government, in the defence of a just cause. So we could link that to the other right reasons from Aquinas as well. And that, of course, relates to conscription, the idea that if the government decides we need to declare war, you should support them, because St. Paul has said, submit to the governing authority. So you should play your part and make your contribution to that war effort. In terms of an Islamic teaching, as we know, the Quran said to fight in the way of God those who fight you. So that would allow fighting in self-defense when attacked. But remember, there are those strict rules which must be followed, such as do not target innocent civilians and do not continue fighting when the enemy surrenders. So really interesting to think about pacifism. It is an extreme commitment, a radical commitment to non-violence, that no matter what, you would not be using physical violence or indeed fighting in a war. Do you think that religious people should be pacifist? Thinking about that previous 12-mark statement, is it the case that our religious believers should always be against violence? Or are there cases, are there situations, are there justifications for war being the right course of action? Let's have a look now, shall we, at weapons of mass destruction, which are weapons causing widespread, indiscriminate damage. Our examples are nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And the key point here is the extent of their destruction, that they can kill hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, and they could ultimately destroy the entire planet. A key term we'll be using is mutually assured destruction, MAD for short, and it's the idea that in a nuclear war, there would be no winners, because all of humanity would be destroyed and the entire planet would be destroyed. Now, in the UK, we have something called the Trident nuclear submarine programme. This costs the government about £3 billion a year. They say that it is needed because we live in a world, with nuclear weapons, which means nuclear war is possible. For example, Russia and the United States of America each have about 5,000 nuclear warheads. But there are other nuclear powers as well, such as China, France, the UK, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. So we know that nations around the world do have nuclear weapons. The UK has them. As I say, it's called the Trident programme. And at all times, there is always a UK nuclear submarine out at sea ready to respond. But that order and instruction can only come from the Prime Minister alone. Now, a key term we're going to talk about is nuclear deterrence. This is the idea that you have the nuclear weapons to deter other countries from using theirs. So we're not spending £3 billion a year having these weapons because we want to use them. The idea is that we have to spend that money as a deterrent. That stops other countries from threatening us with theirs. So the argument is we need nuclear weapons as a deterrent. Some people have put forward nuclear disarmament, the idea that we would ask all the countries in the world to voluntarily give up their nuclear weapons. But at the moment, we know that several countries do have them and they continue to maintain them. So let's talk about weapons of mass destruction and whether they can ever be supported by religious people. Is there a support for having them as a deterrent or even using them as a weapon of war? And then, of course, we'll talk about why religious people might be completely against both having them, possessing them, and then, of course, using them. Let's start with our support for them. You could say that the Bible teaches eye for an eye, of course. So some would argue deterrence prevents attack, because that principle of eye for an eye prevents other countries using theirs. They know that if they fired theirs towards us, we're able to fire one straight back. So we could say we need to have weapons of mass destruction because that maintains balance and it protects the nation. They are a deterrent against other countries using theirs because of that principle of retribution. eye for an eye. They know we have them, so we would be prepared to use them in terms of it then deterring them. Another teaching we could use is from St. Paul. He said to submit to the governing authorities. So Christians may support the government if they will be keeping people safe. So, of course, you could say if the government thinks we need these weapons to keep us safe and ensure that we're protected, we should support that decision. It is for the government and the Ministry of Defence to decide what weapons we need in order to protect our country in the 21st century. So you could say you need to submit to the governing authorities. If they believe that this is how we're going to keep people safe in this country, then we should support that. And then in terms of our Islamic teachings, of course, we know from the Quran to fight in the way of God those who fight you. So again, it's this argument for deterrence, that we need these weapons to defend us or as a deterrent against aggression. So if other countries have them, we should have them so that we're able to fight those who fight you, which of course is our verse from the Quran. So our support for nuclear weapons would very much be about it being a deterrent, but also about using them as a last resort. So if we link this to and we apply this to the just war theory, this of course meets the criteria for being declared by legitimate authority because it's only the Prime Minister who can authorise their use, but also it would be meeting the criteria for the declared by legitimate authority and also as a last resort, that this needs to be available to us as a last resort, that we could use them if we were targeted. But of course, the argument is by that point, the deterrent has failed. If they've fired their nuclear weapon towards you and you're then sending one back, we're going to have the destruction of the entire planet. So in practice, it kind of starts to fall apart. But on paper, the idea is that if they're being declared by legitimate authority and they would only be used as a last resort, we could actually justify having them and possessing them. But of course, if we're saying that if they were used, it would destroy the whole planet and everybody on it, that then raises questions about whether they are proportionate and whether they can ever be fully justified. So let's have a look at our arguments against, shall we? So for Christians, of course, we could use the Ten Commandments, which teach do not kill, do not murder. Weapons of mass destruction cause indiscriminate mass death. That is a really important word to use when you are writing about them. It is not going to discriminate between civilians and combatants. That weapon is going to destroy everybody. So we know that innocent civilians will be targeted. That is the very nature of these weapons. So if we think about the right way of conducting a war as part of just war theory, this would be seen as violating that because it targets innocent civilians. If you are sending a nuclear weapon, you are targeting innocent people because these weapons are indiscriminate. They are not focused on people fighting the war. They will destroy everything and everybody in the way. And of course, we could therefore say that breaks God's commandment against murder. It violates the sanctity of human life and it leads to mutually assured destruction. So Pope Benedict XVI said that in a nuclear war, there would be no victors, only victims, that everybody would die and the entire planet would be destroyed. And that, of course, would go against the duty of stewardship. The Bible says that God put man in the garden to take care of it. We know that nuclear and chemical weapons destroy creation and they would harm future generations. There might well not be a planet left for those future generations to inhabit because of that mutually assured destruction. So that would violate the duty of stewardship because we could, in a nuclear war, destroy the entire planet. So, of course, it would violate the sanctity of human life. It would also violate the duty of stewardship. So that is why Christians may be against having them and certainly be against using them. What about our Islamic teachings? Well, again, we can talk about stewardship. In the Hadith, Prophet Muhammad said, God has appointed you his stewards. So We know that in Islam, humans are caliphs. It is your duty to care for creation and look after the world. Prophet Muhammad said, the whole earth is a place of worship. So destroying the environment is sinful. And we know these weapons cause that widespread, indiscriminate damage. And so they could not be used. It would be unjustifiable to use them, not only because it violates the sanctity of life and it kills innocent people, but it also destroys the entire planet. And if we then bring in our verse from the Quran, do not overstep the limits. Remember, the Quran says to fight in the way of God those who fight you, but do not overstep the limits. We could say that this clearly violates that verse because weapons of mass destruction are disproportionate. They go too far. They really do overstep the limits because of how many innocent people they kill. So you could say that there is never a justification for their use because of the damage that they cause to human life, but also to the entire planet. So when the Quran says, do not overstep the limits, we can say that weapons of mass destruction absolutely do that. And so they cannot be justified, they cannot be supported by religious teachings. So if we take a step back and think about whether weapons of mass destruction can be supported by religious people, of course, you could say they can be supported as a deterrent because the Bible says eye for an eye. So we need to have a balanced defense. If other countries have these weapons, it is right that we do too. You could also refer to St. Paul, submit to the governing authorities. So if the government thinks we need them to ensure safety and protection, we should support that decision. And of course, to fight those who fight you. If your adversaries, if your enemies around the world have these weapons, surely it makes sense that you can have them as well so you can defend yourself. I remember the Quran says, fight in the way of God those who fight you. So it could be justified in self-defense. But of course, our arguments against are related to the scale and the nature of them, that they cause such widespread, indiscriminate damage. So even if there were the right reasons for having them in terms of legitimate authority and last resort, you could say that in terms of the way they are used, cannot be justified because innocent civilians are targeted and they're disproportionate because the Bible says do not kill. They can kill hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people. A nuclear war would kill billions of people. Indeed, it could kill everyone. And of course, it's about stewardship as well. That important duty in both Christianity and Islam to care for the environment, but that would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war. So there are teachings on this topic. As I say, we could get this as a 12-mark question, but for your earlier questions on the paper as well, make sure that you know both your supportive teachings and also your arguments against. Let's have a look now at our final topic, which is religion and peacemaking. This very much brings everything we've talked about together, and it helps us to also think about some case studies you could bring into your exam answers. Peacemaking means working to bring about peace and reconciliation. If we do think then about what are the consequences of wars, we know that they are catastrophic. Death, the destruction of homes, the displacement of people, economic collapse and poverty, damage to schools and hospitals, and of course, as well, psychological trauma. So for Christians and Muslims, they believe that they have a duty to help the victims of war and also then, of course, to be peacemakers. If we link back to our first topic, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, and the Quran teaches Muslims to say words of peace. What might they practically do? They might donate to aid charities who are helping in a war zone. They might offer to house refugees and give them a safe place to live. They might join a peaceful protest against the war. They might pray for peace and ask God for help. Let's look at our Christian teachings and case study. Remember, Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers. Christians are called to work for peace and to resolve conflict. St. Paul wrote in the Bible to live at peace with everyone. Christians should therefore promote harmony and avoid violence where possible. Jesus, as we know, said to forgive not 7, but 77 times. So forgiving others restores relationships and helps to rebuild peace, because, of course, forgiveness must come first so that reconciliation can follow, the rebuilding of that relationship and reconnecting, which, as we know, restores harmony. And then if we want a Christian case study to refer to, we could refer to Tear Fund, who work worldwide to support reconciliation, justice and peace building efforts. What about our Islamic teachings on peacemaking? Well, the Quran teaches Muslims to say words of peace. So, of course, that tells us that Muslims are encouraged to promote peace through both their actions and their words. The Hadith teachings from Prophet Muhammad say that whoever makes reconciliation is rewarded by God. So, restoring relationships and resolving conflict is seen as an act of worship. In terms of our key terms, then, we could refer to the Ummah, the worldwide Islamic community. And we know that Muslims believe that community unity is very important because, remember, Tawheed is the oneness and unity of God. That should be reflected in the oneness and the unity of the community. Muhammad wanted to unite all people and bring them together. So maintaining peace strengthens the global Muslim community. It brings people together. And that is why organisations such as Islamic Relief would promote social cohesion, charity work and peace building worldwide. Really important, we know case studies of peacemakers for both religions, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., who we've spoken about today. And hopefully that has been helpful in terms of planning and preparing for the Theme D section of the Paper 2 exam. Please do let me know any comments, any questions in the comments below. And I wish you every success with your studies. Thank you and have a good day.